Hey there, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I've got another product review for you here on the channel today. This time around, I'm checking out the new Sliger S620 Mini-ITX chassis. Sliger is a relatively new manufacturer in the small form factor market, but they've made a big impact. They have a huge number of offerings. You should definitely check out their site. It's practically an encyclopedia of every way you can build an ITX chassis, every size, every format, every configuration. It's really interesting what Sliger has done, and they are based in the United States and manufacture all their products in Nevada. Now, that does increase the price. So this is a $250 case base, and then there are options you can add to it. And you may say right off the bat, hey, I'm not interested. Okay, I'm going to stop watching this video. I'm not interested in a $250 case. Definitely not a small case like this. Well, let me explain this to you a little bit more. There are a lot of boutique manufacturers out there. Most of them actually have a manufacturer doing the work for them in Taiwan. Basically, Lian Li is actually manufacturing almost all those boutique SFF systems that you see on the internet. Now, Sliger is different. They have a manufacturing line in the US, they manufacture it there. That means a lot of things, particularly for US buyers. You get free shipping and you get faster shipping than you do from Taiwan. It also means you don't have that lineup, that huge queue of people waiting for these cases. Now, the S620 is really interesting to me because from my point of view, if I were going to sketch out how an ITX chassis should look, this would be it. Not just in terms of the aesthetics, which I really like, but also the layout of the components inside. Now, this comes to 16.3 liters technically from the specs, but like a lot of manufacturers, Sliger is leaving out the feet, which is a necessary component of the cooling design. You have to have this chassis raised off the surface because otherwise your GPU gets no cooling air. So this actually comes out to about 17.7 liters with the feet, and they are required. So from my point of view, this is not a 16.3 liter chassis, but a lot of other manufacturers kind of mess around with the volume numbers there. So I don't think Sliger is really to blame. It's just a fact that a lot of times you're going to see dimensions that are just, the chassis itself without the feet. So even at 17.7 liters, it's pretty small. Yes, I know that Cooler Master has a competing offering that's really popular these days, but that's also a lot larger than it looks like on the spec sheet. So the NR200 comes in around 18.5 liters technically, but it's actually closer to 20 liters when you include the necessary feet. So this is quite a bit smaller, even if the form factor looks the same, and it can hold much bigger coolers. That's kind of the miracle of this chassis. And of course, I'm going to be testing the biggest coolers you can fit in here. I'm going to be testing both the D15 from Noctua and the Castle 280EX from Deepcool. So these are pretty much the pinnacle of cooling that you can get in an ITX chassis. Of course, the D15, everyone wants to cram that into their ITX chassis. Some chassis claim that type of compatibility and don't quite have it, and that's going to come into play here. So there's a caveat there with the D15. And then the 280EX being a very fine example of a 280mm all-in-one cooler, comes in around 130, 140 bucks. That's also going to be tested in here, and let me tell you, I've done the testing, I've done the installation, I'm going to show you how it looks. It is not easy. And I actually saw some people discussing this on Reddit because frankly, it is so tight that some people, including myself actually, would probably look at the components and say, I can't get a 280mm all-in-one in there. But let me show you something. So there you can see I actually do have a 280 in there. It is actually longer than the opening it fits into. So therein lies the problem. I will be showing you how that works. And there was that problem with this cooler is also a problem with the D15. So I'll be getting into all of that in this video. Now, in terms of my test setup, I used a Ryzen 7 4750G 8-core 16-thread processor. Now, this is a little bit unusual. It was never released at retail, but it's relatively representative of what people might use in this chassis. It's very comparable to the Ryzen 7 3700X or the Ryzen 7 5800X, for example. And I think it's a really cool processor because I can use it with every ITX system, even those that don't have space for a video card because it has built-in Vega graphics. Of course, here I'm using an RTX 2080 Ti graphics card. Now, this is a little bit older, and at this point, it's not quite representative of what people might be using. For instance, the RTX 3080 and RTX 3090 put out a lot more heat. They're 320 and 350 watts respectively versus 250 watts for this card. They're also larger. NVIDIA actually increased its reference size from 10.6 inches in the RTX 2080 Ti to 11.2 inches with the RTX 3080 and 12.3 inches with the RTX 3090. And that 3090 is also triple slot. Now, it will fit in this chassis, but it will cause some other thermal issues that you may have to anticipate. For instance, it will fill almost the entire volume of this section down here for the video card, and it's also going to be putting out 100 watts more than the 2080 Ti in terms of heat. So it's a hot running GPU. I don't have one to test. I do have 3080s in my arsenal, but I decided, I want to show you apples to apples benchmarks versus the other cases that I've tested recently, so I stuck with my 2080 Ti. Now, to keep things interesting, I did alter one thing about my test setup versus the other test setups I've used. I always max out the coolers in my ITX chassis reviews. So if something's really slim and needs a low profile cooler, I'm going to show you how it performs. If something can fit a 280, I'm going to show you how that performs. So you're going to see a few different cases in the benchmarks later in this video that use different coolers. I'm going to spell that out right in the benchmarks. Now, before I get into those benchmarks, I will be giving you a tour of this chassis, some cool features, how I installed the coolers. And I also want to mention that there are a lot of configuration options. So again, base cost is $250, but they also give you a few different color options. They give you a glass panel option, which I think is a terrible choice, but it's there if you want it. So definitely some options that you get on the Sliger website, and that's really cool. Basically, if this were another manufacturer, this would be like 5 or 6 different SKUs. But this is just one SKU, the S620, and it's built to order the way you want it, which is neat. That does cost more, but as you'll see from my product tour and my benchmarks, I think it's worth it. So without further ado, let's jump inside this chassis, see what it's all about, and then we'll get into those benchmarks. So first I'll show you the exploded view of this chassis. You're going to get familiar with this because you're going to need to do it. Luckily, all the panels are held in by ball studs, which makes it really easy to take it apart. Here's a look inside the frame of the chassis where you'll be placing the motherboard. Take note that you're going to have to get familiar with a lot of screws. I counted 75, 6 different types, and there is no manual, so you're going to do a lot of mixing and matching to get it right. The first step to building this PC will be installing the motherboard, which I've done here, and then installing the power supply. Note that the shroud has to be removed to install the power supply, then you reinstall it, and you should really tidy up those cables immediately because once you start putting in other components, it becomes harder to reach those cables. Here I have the 2080 Ti installed, and my next step was to install the Noctua D15. It barely fit. It touches the top of the chassis, and you may actually want to go with the D15S, which gives you a little bit more clearance. The front fan actually would not fit because it would have to sit too high and it would protrude out of the chassis. So I've instead installed that front fan on the side here. It's not quite as effective as it would be attached to the cooler, but it's all right. I'm also going to show you benchmarks with the fan at the bottom of the chassis blowing into the 2080 Ti, as you can see here. Even though you can't use this fan on the cooler, it's still a nice perk to buying the more expensive model. Now, like I said, I am going to show you how I fit this cooler in here, and it was an absolute challenge. There were multiple points during the process where I said, this can't possibly work. But it did work, and let me show you that video now. At this point in the video, I didn't even think I was going to be able to get this in, so I hadn't bolted down the pump yet. I figured I'd just try this and then take it out and call it quits. But lo and behold, after a few more attempts, I was actually able to get the radiator into the chassis. Now, it did scrape some of the paint off the radiator, but here you'll see that I'm actually able to squeeze it in. Now, sadly, I had to do this all over again because I hadn't actually bolted down the pump, but here is the final product. Everything fits. It looks fine now, but it wasn't easy to do. Now, one issue with this setup is that the GPU is totally cut off, so it cannot exhaust up. It has to exhaust out the sides and the back. And unfortunately, the side panel is not perforated in front of the GPU, so we'll look at the benchmarks to see how that works out. And just take note, for my liquid cooler benchmarks, I did keep this Noctua fan in the bottom of the chassis. Starting with idle at the desktop, my main focus here is looking at the noise levels and seeing if they are adequately controlled. Overall, I was quite pleased with the Sliger S620. It was between 25 and 27 decibels in the 3 different setups that I tested with it. Actually, the quietest was the D15 with the bottom mounted fan. And that's also pretty good in terms of temps, although at idle, I really don't care too much about temps unless there's something that suggests that it's gonna translate to some problems at load. And of course, it's hard to miss that the Sliger S620 with the standard D15 and a side-mounted fan, along with the Silverstone SG15 with the D15S and a side-mounted fan, are both pretty bad here in terms of GPU temps, and that will translate to some bad temps when we get to the gaming benchmarks. But first, let's look at CPU-Z. And here we see that actually the Sliger S620 is definitely in front of the pack. It's doing quite well, particularly with that deep-cool Castle 280EX installed, coming in 59 degrees and just 40 decibels, which is really good. That beats the Silverstone SG14 with its 240mm all-in-one, which was a little bit hotter and a little bit louder. With all that said, if what you care about most is noise, you're probably going to want to stick with an air cooler like the NH-D15 or D15S. But if you're going to be gaming with your system, I actually suggest you go with a liquid cooler. It doesn't just help with the CPU temps, it helps with the GPU temps as well. So here we can see that the Sliger S620 with that 280mm all-in-one has phenomenally low CPU temps and also very low GPU temps. And it's quite quiet at 33 decibels. Now, if you want the best balance, you'd probably go with the NH-D15 and the bottom mounted fan. It's the quietest in this roundup and still very good with a 71 degree GPU temp. What I would not suggest is to have a side mounted fan. And I know a lot of people would probably say it's common sense that if you put a fan on the side of your chassis, it's going to lead to good temps. It does not. And it's partly because that GPU is fighting the side mounted fan. You have two different airflows going in different directions. The GPU pushing air up, that fan pushing air back down and in. It's not a good setup. And I'm going to urge you over and over again to think about airflows when you're setting up your fans in any gaming system. And Sliger gets a lot of credit here. The setup of this chassis is simply ideal for getting heat out, particularly when used with an all-in-one. I think that is your ideal setup if you want to maximize your performance. All right, what can I say? I love this chassis. I think Sliger's hit a grand slam with the S620. They've had a lot of iterations over the past few years, and some of their chassis have been better than others. You know, I tested the SV590. I didn't think that much of it, but this case is definitely the bomb. I love this chassis. This is the ideal ITX chassis for a high-end system. Now, there are just two things I would change about this. First of all, I would perforate this panel all the way down. Now with my RTX 2080 Ti, I didn't really see any negative effects from this, even though it kind of closed off some airflow to the RTX 2080 Ti. But if you had a larger GPU like an RTX 3090 that took up most of the space down here, it would be right up against this panel and it will get really hot, particularly if you have a radiator right above it, basically blocking off all airflow. So I think this is a quick change that they should do. Maybe they'll come out with a version 2, or maybe they'll come out with a panel you can buy afterwards. The other thing that I found slightly annoying is that I had overall 75 screws by my count and no manual. Now, Sliger says that's coming soon, but they've said that about a lot of other chassis as well, and then they never produced that manual. I think, you know, producing manuals is hard. You know, it's very different from manufacturing a case. So hopefully they'll get that manual out. If they don't, one thing I would suggest is go to some of their other manuals just to get like the legend for the screws, because honestly, I spent hours trying to sort through these screws for this chassis, figuring out which ones were the right size and fit into the holes. It was really more time than I cared to spend figuring out which screw went where. So a manual would solve that problem, and I hope Sliger actually does produce a manual for this chassis. It would be nice. But other than those two issues, which overall were minor for me and the performance of my system, this is just an awesome chassis. It gives you so many options. It's really fun to work with. All right, so that's another important part of building an ITX system. You know you're going to have to work at it, right? Because you're fitting high-end components into a small space. But with this chassis, you get to think about it. You get to say, well, where do I want my components? What's going to really produce the best results? And I think I've showed you a couple of different options in the benchmarks. Yes, there are other ways I could configure this. I could have put some slim fans up top. I could have reoriented the PSU to fit a fan in front, which is cool because a lot of ITX chassis don't actually have any airflow coming in through the front. They're totally closed, like the SG14 and SG15 that I've reviewed recently on the channel. So I really view it holistically and say, how am I going to get the best overall thermal dynamics in my chassis? And I think I've actually achieved pretty good benchmarks here. And, you know, definitely comment down below if you think I could have changed something in the way I oriented my fans or I configured this chassis. But I'm pretty happy with the results. It performed amazingly well, and that's what I wanted. So, hey, it worked out for me. Feel free to, you know, accessorize and customize to your heart's content, because you can do that with this chassis. Now, I know, like I said at the beginning, some of you probably stopped watching. Maybe you come back after giving it a second thought that the $250 price point is too high for a chassis like this. Well, you know, after using this chassis, I think it's well worth it. It's really well built. It has a lot of features you wouldn't find in mass-produced chassis. You have a lot of customization options, both out of the box and then aftermarket from Sliger. And frankly, it looks great and it performs great. So isn't that what you want when you spend a lot of money on a chassis? Well, yeah, I think so, and this delivers it. So in no way do I think it's overpriced. It delivers the goods. I would give this a perfect score. It's my favorite ITX chassis ever. If you enjoyed this video, definitely give me a like and subscribe. If you have questions, post them down below. I'll be sure to get back to you. And as always, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I will catch you next time.